Hello everybody, my name is Sachin Date. I'm here to talk about my presentation on a social network-based approach to analyzing artistic influences on American stand-up comedians. So let's dive straight into the presentation. So the purpose of the study was to quantitatively examine the origins and patterns of artistic influences on the work of American stand-up comedians. To define artistic influence, which happens to be a stubbornly qualitative property, via a set of observable proxies, to examine patterns in the influence graphs of individual stand-up comedians, and finally to analyze path length and clustering properties of the network of artistic influences of American stand-up comedians. So here's a summary of our findings. So first thing that we found was that the chains of artistic influence on American stand-up comedians originated from times much older than the vaudevillian era of the late 1800s to the early 1900s. And in fact, they originated from European writers of the late Middle Ages. We found that an overwhelming volume of direct artistic influence on American stand-up comedians came from individuals who were born within two generations of the influenced comedians, with more than 50% of the direct influence coming from individuals of the same generation. We also found that the total volume of artistic influence, both direct and indirect, on American stand-up comedians followed a distinct 2080 style Pareto pattern. And then finally, we found that the social influence network of American stand-up comedians exhibited small world network properties as characterized by average path length and large cluster, as characterized by a smaller average path length and a larger clustering coefficient as compared to a random graph of the same size and complexity. So here's a few examples of previous work done in this field. I'm not going to go through the material on this slide. You can read all about it in the accompanying paper. So let's talk about the methods. So what we did was we modeled all influences as a social network in which persons were represented as nodes and influences were represented as unweighted directed edges. We defined the total influence volume of person A on person B as the number of simple paths running from A to B, and therefore the out degree of node A was the total direct influence volume of A exerted by A on all individuals that A was directly connected to. We termed the group of nodes that represented the set of American stand-up comedians as the base social group, and we termed the total number of simple paths incident on this group as the total influence volume on the base social group. We also termed the total number of simple paths originating from some node A in the network and terminating on nodes in the base social group as the total influence volume, direct plus indirect, of that node on the base social group. And then finally, in order to analyze the social network of influences for small world phenomena, we use the measures shortest path length, average shortest path length, and average clustering coefficient. We used Wikipedia as the single source of data for this study. And what we did was we fetched the Wikipedia entry for all the comedians that were listed in the Wikipedia category American stand-up comedians. And then to this set of entries, we added entries that were listed as stand-up comedians in the following three Wikipedia categories: 19th century, 20th century, and 21st century American comedians. We parsed each Wikipedia entry for artistic influences. We look for influences in the influences section of the entry, as well as anywhere else inside the entry. And sometimes the Wikipedia entries of influencers mentioned comedians whom they influenced in the legacy section of the entry, and sometimes in some other sections of the entry also. So we took into account all of these back references. So what we did was we started with each comedian in the base social group, and then we worked our way upward and downward from that node, and then we traced out all the chains of influences on that comedian. And then we kind of put everything together into a unweighted directed graph of influences. We allowed influencers of stand-up comedians in the base social group to have non-US nationalities, and we didn't even require them to be stand-up comedians. The only two restrictions that we placed on an influencer were that they have written, directed, or performed at least one work of a humorous nature, and they directly or indirectly influenced a comedian in the base social group. For each person, we also collected the date of birth and the date of death wherever that data was available. The network building procedure that we followed basically yielded a social network of size 1710 nodes with 1280 directed edges, consisting of a base social group of 1532 American stand-up comedians, out of which 1208 comedians did not influence, nor were they influenced by any other individual. So this set of 1208 comedians was represented as a set of isolated nodes in the network. And then of the remaining 324 comedians, 239 were influenced by at least one comedian, and then 89 influenced at least one other individual, although they themselves weren't influenced by anybody. So here's how the network looked like. So basically one giant connected component shown on the top left, and then a whole lot of isolated nodes at the bottom, and then a smattering of small connected components up at the top, which are themselves disconnected from that giant connected component on the top left. So we found two cycles in the network, two cycle between the American stand-ups Jerry Seinfeld and Steve Martin, and then another two cycle between the Canadian writer and humorist Stephen Leacock and the American humorist Robert Benchley. So here's the data on the direct influencers of the base social group. So basically, the significant finding here was that the influence volume on the base social group revealed a distinct 2080 style Pareto-like pattern, with about 29% of direct influencers generating nearly 75% of the direct influence volume on the base social group. And then the top 10 direct influencers of the base social group influenced roughly 17% of the comedians in the base social group, while contributing around 1/4 of the direct influence volume on this group. So here's the distribution of the influences by the influencer. The x-axis is the list of influencers, and the y-axis is the number of comedians influenced by each influencer. So as you can see, a highly skewed distribution with a very long tail. So here's some additional data on the direct influences on the base social group. Once again, you can see the cumulative graph at the bottom that shows a distinct Pareto style pattern. And then the table at the top that just gives you some additional numeric detail. All of this data is described in great detail in the accompanying paper. So this is the list of top 10 influencers of the base social group. So this is the list of direct influencers. One thing to note here is that of the top 5 influencers in this table, 4 of them are dead. So Richard Pryor, Josh Carlin, Johnny Carson, and Lenny Bruce are no longer alive. But they continue, their work continues to impact the work of American stand-up comedians who are alive today to a very large extent. So let's look at the analysis of birth year to birth year time spans between the influencer and influencee. So the major finding over here was that an overwhelming majority of the set of 1003 influences where the birth year data was available for both the influencer and the influencee. The influencer was born within 2 generations of the prodigy, and more than half of the direct influence volume came from within the same generation. So overall, what the data indicated was an implicit predisposition of American stand-up comedians to draw direct influence from individuals from within the same generation. So here's some more detail on that data. On the left side is the graph of cumulative percentage of influencer-influencee pairs plotted against the number of generations of separation between the influencer and influencee. And then on the right side, you have a set of three tables that kind of go a little bit into the details of that distribution. Again, a lot of this is described in additional amount of detail in the accompanying paper. Let's look at the data on the set of influencers who influence the base social group both directly as well as indirectly. So the major finding here was that the total direct plus indirect influence volume by influencer once again revealed a highly skewed distribution and a pronounced 20/80 style Pareto pattern, with about 17% of influencers contributing 90% of the total influence volume on the base social group. And then of course this time a very different set of top 10 influencers emerged. So this slide basically again goes into some additional detail on the data. The cumulative style graph on the left side again reveals a skewed Pareto style pattern, and then the tables on the right kind of get into some more detail on the distribution. Once again, all of this data is described in additional detail in the accompanying paper. So here's the set of top 10 influencers, both direct as well as indirect, of the base social group. So one significant thing to note here is that all 10 of them are no longer alive, as can be expected from data of this sort. Some well-known names here, like the comedy pair Laurel and Hardy at positions 4 and 5, and then William Shakespeare at position 6, and then we have Charles Dickens at position 10. So just to give you an idea about how dense and rich is the graph of influences emanating from these influencers. So here's the graph of influences of Charles Dickens. As you can see, a very large number of people either directly or indirectly influenced by Charles Dickens. Similarly, you can see a great amount of diversity and density and just richness in the pattern of influences emanating out of the comedian Dan Leno. So this graph shows, so this graph is basically a subgraph showing the 45 longest chains of influence of length 16 each in the overall graph of all influences. So in this graph, on the left side, you have a set of 5 people: William Shakespeare, Henry Fielding, then you have Charles Matthews, Tobias Smollett, and John Foster. And then on the right side, you have a set of American stand-up comedians whom they indirectly influenced. The thing to note here is the role of Woody Allen, the American comedian and actor, director, producer. And the thing to note about Woody Allen's role over here is how he seems to be routing influences from the set of people on the left side, which are largely non-stand-up comedians, to the set of people on the right side who are primarily American stand-up comedians. So he's playing this role of routing influences over from one group of people to the other group. So here's kind of some more detail on the distribution of simple path lengths. So what we found here was that the distribution of simple path lengths from all direct and indirect influencers of the base social group, 2 members of the base social group showed a moderately long-tailed pattern, with most of the mass of influence concentrated within path lengths of 1 through 8. So here's a summary of the analysis of shortest path lengths. So what we found was the maximum shortest path length was 7 across the network of influences. And then almost all of the influencers were able to influence the work of American stand-ups, either directly or indirectly, via at most 5 intermediate comedians. So clearly unmistakable signs of small network behavior. So finally, we went into the details of that behavior. What we did was we followed the methods and the definitions used by a paper published by Watts and Strogatz in 1998 on small world phenomena and small network behaviors. And the essence of it was that we found that the artistic influence network of American stand-up comedians did actually exhibit distinct small world network properties, as evidenced by a smaller average shortest path length and a higher average clustering coefficient as compared to random graphs of equivalent size and complexity. The details of this procedure that we followed to perform this analysis and arrive at these results, it's described on this slide, as well as it's described in with some amount of additional explanation in the accompanying paper. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.